Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Adaptation to Climate Change, National and Subnational Coherence, Coordination and Cooperation at Regional Level, an event hosted by SACEP and Energy for SD. As you are well aware, SACEP, the South Asia Cooperative Environment Programme, is an intergovernmental organization established in 1982 by the governments of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka to promote environmental protection and management in the region. Energy for SD, the network of regional governments for sustainable development, was created in 2002 to raise the voice of subnational governments in international decision-making and to promote cooperation among subnational governments from across the world under a North-South and a South-South basis. Today, more than 50 members from 27 countries and 4 continents work together for sustainable development and tackling climate change in the framework of Energy for SD. Dr. Khurshid, on behalf of SACEP, and myself, on behalf of Energy for SD, are most delighted to introduce such remarkable speakers today, including high-level representatives and authorities from the national and subnational levels, as well as an expert from the academia working at local level. The reasoning of this event is that to achieve the international goals agreed by the parties within international organizations, particularly the UN system, strong communication and cooperation must be developed between the national level, the subnational level, and the local level. The side event will showcase successful stories and experiences developed within the collaboration of these 3 governments I have just mentioned. So it is my pleasure, I'm most delighted to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Zaid Hamid, Federal Minister for Climate Change of Pakistan. Minister Zaid is member to the Pakistan National Assembly since 2002. He holds a BA degree in law with honors from the University of Cambridge and the University of Punjab. He was a member of the Civil Service of Pakistan from 1970 to 1978 and a successful entrepreneur from 1978 to 1988. Earlier positions in the Pakistan government include being a Minister of State for Defense, Minister for Privatization and Investment, and Minister for Law, Justice, and Human Rights. He is well known for his extensive work in the creation of environmental laws, namely the Pakistan Environment Protection Act that was approved in 1997 and the rules, regulations prescribed thereunder. Minister Hamid, Your Excellency, we would like to hear how the government of Pakistan is committed to climate adaptation and how do you ensure these results are achieved in the ground. So how do you cooperate with the different governmental levels and involve stakeholders and civil society? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Excellency, Prince Mustafa Zahir, Director General of the National Environmental Protection Agency of Afghanistan, Mr. Chencho Norbu, Secretary of the National Environmental Commission, Bhutan, Mr. Khurshid, other colleagues of the South Asian community, other distinguished speakers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and bonjour. It is an honor and a pleasure to participate in this important event on the adaptation to climate change, national and subnational coherence, coordination, and cooperation at the regional level. I would like to congratulate the organizers, the South Asia Cooperative Environment Program, and the Network of Regional Governments for Sustainable Development for arranging this event, and thank them, in particular, good friend Mr. Khurshid, the Director General, for inviting me to participate and to say a few words. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the issue of adaptation to climate change is, of course, of crucial importance to the whole South Asian region, which is home to over 1 billion people, many of whom are unfortunately living below the poverty level. Apart from its dense population, the South Asian region is also one of the most ecologically diverse areas of the world. It has faced a multitude of climate-induced disasters, ranging from glacial melt, sea level rise, drought, cyclones, and shifts in rain patterns, especially monsoon rains. These disasters are not only serious threats to food and water security, but also displace the residents, creating the problem of climate refugees. Now, these adverse effects of climate change are of immense concern to Pakistan. We contribute less than 1% of the total annual global greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, we are ranked amongst the top 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change. Pakistan today faces major risks related to climate change, including glacial melt, variable monsoons, recurrent floods, sea water intrusion, higher average temperature, and higher frequency of droughts. Millions of people are affected, and colossal damage is caused on a recurring basis. As you can imagine, these threats pose major survival concerns for Pakistan, particularly in relation to the country's water security, food security, and energy security, and they have enormous adverse consequences for all the socio-economic sectors. To cope with these extreme climate change impacts, Pakistan has developed comprehensive policies and plans that include both adaptation and mitigation measures. We have put in place a perspective plan called Vision 2025, a national climate change policy and a framework for its implementation, a national disaster risk reduction policy, and a national sustainable development strategy. Pakistan is perhaps the first country in the world whose National Assembly passed a unanimous resolution adopting the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda as the Pakistan National Development Agenda. Our parliament has also become green by converting to 100% solar energy. And we will be introducing in parliament next week the historic Pakistan Climate Change Bill, which will establish a high-level policy-making Pakistan Climate Change Council and also a Pakistan Climate Change Authority, which will prepare and supervise implementation of adaptation and mitigation projects in the various sectors. I may add that all the provinces and regions of Pakistan will be represented on the council. Implementations of projects will also take place through the provincial and the regional governments. And the provinces are also preparing their own action plans in accordance with the national climate change policy. So this is the answer to that question about coordination and coherence between the national and the subnational governments. And apart from these measures taken by the government, I am proud to inform you that the people of Pakistan have shown remarkable resilience in the face of these grave challenges and have courageously adapted. This is forced adaptation to climate change. We are hopeful that with the faster economic growth in coming years, especially as a result of projects such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, economic resilience and social resilience will increase still further and help us to better cope with future threats. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is, in fact, a prime example of successful South-South cooperation. And this can serve as a model for coordination and cooperation at the South Asian regional level also. The nature of the common challenges that our region faces are complex, multidimensional, and transnational. The multi-hazard threats posed by natural calamities indicate a dire need as well as great scope for mutual cooperation at the regional level. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, with its people-oriented approach, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals to end poverty, fight inequality and injustice, and tackle climate change, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, with its adaptation and mitigation measures, the World Humanitarian Summit, with its focus on global humanitarian action, and Habitat 3, with its emphasis on sustainable urbanization can provide valuable opportunities not only for assessment of each country's progress in implementation of these global frameworks, but also development of regional initiatives for cooperation. The links amongst these 5 global frameworks can provide the much needed direction and momentum for South Asian cooperation at all tiers. By exchanging successful experiences, sharing good ideas, knowledge, and practices, and establishing global partnerships, we can better address climate change impacts and achieve sustainable development, and thereby enhance South Asian cooperation in the context of implementation of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I am certain that such South Asian cooperation will help ensure sustainable development of our respective countries and the well-being and prosperity of our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this comprehensive explanation. It is now my pleasure to introduce you His Royal Highness Prince Mustafa Zair, who is at present Director General of the National Environmental Protection Agency of Afghanistan. He's the grandson of Afghanistan's last king, His Royal Highness Mohammed Zair, and Prince Mustafa acted as a diplomat for 15 years. At present, within his portfolio at the National Environmental Protection Agency, he is responsible for environmental policymaking, regulation, and enforcement. One of his many achievements is an act in the Afghan constitution declaring the responsibility of every Afghan citizen to protect and preserve the environment and to hand it over to the next generation in the most pristine condition possible. Besides, his efforts to develop renewable energies in Afghanistan are tireless. In the political scene, in 2007, he joined the United Front of Afghanistan, a political coalition that defends the establishment of a parliamentary system for the country. On April 2010, Prince Mustafa received the Champions of the Earth Award by the United Nations Environment Programme for his work in transforming environmental policy and promoting sustainability in Afghanistan in one of the most difficult moments of its history. Prince Mustafa, Your Highness, we would be very pleased to hear how the government of Afghanistan is committed to climate adaptation and how do you ensure that these efforts are really transmitted into the ground with the local communities. Thank you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the Merciful and the Compassionate. Your Excellencies, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to deeply thank my good friend, Dr. Khurshid, the current Director General of SACEP, and the organizers of this important side event for inviting me to be present here. I am both honored and humbled to be amongst you. My country, despite huge challenges in terms of security, socioeconomic challenges, and living conditions, has participated actively in the whole process of negotiation of parties to limit the average global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level, and for another legally binding agreement at the Paris Climate Conference in December of last year. In November of 2015, Afghanistan, as a least developed country, committed to setting itself on a course of a low-emission development path. By signing the Paris Agreement, Afghanistan has agreed to take all of the necessary steps needed in curbing emissions in order to lay the foundations for a sustainable future. Now, as we are in the 22nd session of the Conference of the Parties, or COP22, in this beautiful city of Marrakesh, in the Kingdom of Morocco, we renew our commitments and look forward to making an active part in the negotiations and information sharing sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, this is an opportunity for my country to share parts of its commitments that have been taken in preparation for COP22. I would like to just touch on the points on the question that Madam asked of our vision, how we want to go forward from here. And I would like to share briefly those points, if I may. Establishment of a national committee for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, as we know it as the NCIPA. The National Committee for the Implementation of the Paris Agreement was established in 2016 and approved by the Cabinet to facilitate and to coordinate the implementation of the Paris Agreement and all of its relevant issues. The committee is comprised of the official delegation members of Afghanistan who participated in the Paris Climate Conference, as well as additional support teams from either other ministries and civil society. Afghanistan signed the Paris Agreements alongside 175 countries at the signing ceremony on the 22nd of April of 2016. The signature of the Paris Agreement shows the country's intention to be bound by the agreement before its ratification inside of Afghanistan by its parliament, which, by the way, the cabinet has passed it, and we have a procedure, as His Excellency Raja Sahib was saying before, in the next few days or a week or two, we are hoping for it to be totally completed, and we will be submitting that to His Excellency, the Secretary General of the United Nations. In accordance to the Kyoto Protocol, as most of other parties, Afghanistan submitted its nationally determined contribution, or INDC, in advance of the COP21 Paris Conference. The conference invited Afghanistan, outlined in Decision 1, CP 21, paragraph 22, to communicate its first NDC no later than when Afghanistan provided its respective instrument of ratification, acceptance, approval, or accession of the Paris Agreement. It is being published online in the NDC platform developed by the UNFCCC Secretariat. There is an option for Afghanistan to inform the Secretariat if it considers, and this is an important point, there is an option for Afghanistan to inform the Secretariat if it considers the previous submission of Afghanistan's intended nationally determined contribution, or INDC, to be NDC, or nationally determined contribution. Clear and detailed national action plans of Afghanistan in line with this 10-year development pathway submitted includes some of, not all, but some I'll be reading for you. Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Action, or NAMA, the NAM program, National Adaptation Program of Action, as we know it as NAPA, Local NAM and Local National Action Plan, known as NAP, its acronyms. Climate Technology Center and Network, we call it CTCN mechanisms, climate governance reports, and so on. As you know, the ratification, as I mentioned before, the ratification process for Afghanistan depends mainly on the system of governance. And in my country, it's a presidential system. It's quite highly centralized. Afghanistan requires the authorization of the parliament for the ratification of the Paris Agreement, as I mentioned before. Hopefully in the next few days, or maximum probably a week or two, I'm very confident that that process, inshallah, God willing, will take place. The process is being led by the National Committee for the Implementation of the Paris Agreement, which the instrument of ratification, acceptance, approval, or accession will be formally submitted to the United Nations Secretary General. It is expected to be completed soon. The active engagement of Afghanistan's citizens, for whom are we working? Is for our citizens. and local communities in the development of the Paris Agreement over the course of 2016 had been a key element in the preparation of the process. Keeping in line this methodology, the outcome and follow-up shall remain transparent and continue to actively involve citizens and local communities at the subnational levels. I can even go to the district levels and to the precinct levels, what we call al-Qadari in Afghanistan. Throughout the preparation process, the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan has been in close communication with bilateral and multilateral partners to actively engage Afghan citizens, civil societies, the academic community, non-governmental organizations, and our international partners. In conclusion, Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, I would like to reiterate my country's commitment to the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the common voice of the global population for a healthy and a sustainable environment for our planet and every single life form that exists upon it. We can, we shall, and we will. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Prince Mustafa, overall for this enthusiastic ending of your presentation. I think it's very inspiring and gives a lot of energy to all parties and stakeholders here today. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Dasho Chencho Novu. He's Secretary of the National Environment Commission of Bhutan. Secretary Dasho is Master's in Soil Science from Cornell University, and his earlier positions include being General Director for Forest and Park Services and Director for Agriculture. Secretary Dasho has extensive experience in climate change and water management, since he participated many times under the Bhutan National Delegation in diverse UNFCCC COPs, and was also chair of the Bhutan Water Partnership. Besides, he is very related to forest preservation and served as a focal person of the UN Convention to combat desertification. So, Secretary Dasho, Your Excellency, we would be very pleased to hear how the government of Bhutan is committed to climate adaptation in the ground, and how are you involving all the necessary parties, including the different levels of government within your country.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to do is briefly tell you a story. Way back in 2010 and 11, at that time I was heading the Department of Agriculture. And I used to be very skeptical about this climate change. And during that period, I did take a snowman track in Bhutan, where you have to travel over 5,000 meters. And when I look at the glaciers, you can see visually that it is receding. And I was asking myself, why? There are no settlements, no activities, why it is receding? When I came to the forest department as a DG of forest, I said that glacial part in a local area, we cannot do anything. It's difficult. What can we do to stop receding? So therefore, we ask probably developed countries to finance and support. And that is actually posing a threat to our own local areas. For instance, one of the first projects that we implemented, NAPA, under LDCF fund, we did execute the lowering of one of the glacial lakes that has been posing a threat. And that was recognized as one of the successful cases in our country. And particularly, it was successful because the NEC Commission, a secretariat that now I'm heading, is an independent body and is chaired by our Prime Minister. And we do have a multi-sectoral task force who looks at all the proposals of climate change. And we do have a cooperation from the sectors, but our job is to lead that proposal or the projects ahead. So that is something that has been helping us in many ways, getting the cooperation from our colleagues. Now, if you look at our NDCs that we submitted last year, it really captured attention from all walks of life. And particularly, it was ambitious. And therefore, in that particular, we have emphasized adaptation. Why adaptation? Like being landlocked, mountainous country, we are under threat of frequent extreme weathers that is really hampering the livelihood of communities. And if you see, these are all isolated. And we believe that it's because of the climate change that is triggering those effects. So in that sense, particularly from the agriculture sector, particularly from the water, I think is getting affected. Now, when it comes to the implementation part, what we have been doing it, if you look at it, firstly, I will share one experience. Again, the challenges working with the farmer. In 2005 and 6, we did take one project called Sustainable Land Management Project. And we took it down right to the farmer's field. Now, what we did at that point of time, we did consult the farmers. We did evaluate the sites. And in some areas, it was very successful because farmers were able to provide what they need. In some areas, we failed because they could not provide us the details. Neither we could give. What we could give is borrowed from elsewhere. So in terms of the adaptation or in terms of the technology, it's a lesson for us that when we borrow technologies from outside without knowing our reality on the ground, sometimes it backfires. That is one. Now, secondly, in this COP conference, if we hear a lot of ecosystem-based adaptation, landscape approach, production, so on and so forth. But if you look all on those approaches, it is a long-term investment. We cannot immediately harvest the result. But what the small farmers need on a small farm is immediate return on their investment. Now, challenge is how can we have a dialogue? And of course, with due respect to our politicians, even our politicians want an immediate and visible result within a few years or a few months. But when you come to dealing with the climate change, when it comes to dealing with the resource management in our own context, in a local area, is a long-term investment. And more importantly, one of the challenges we have in a small country is the information, the institutional gap. Now, how can we strengthen it? And these are some of the things that we always connect with our partners and tell them that you need to put into our context, because we cannot equate small countries in Asia with small countries in Africa. We have our own specific problems. Of course, we may grow wheat, we may grow crop, but environment is slightly different. So in that context, in our experience, in our back at home, we always engage farmers first, and we listen to them. And I think in terms of this adaptation in agriculture, they do have some solutions. I think it's a matter of multiplying that and sharing else from one corner to another, instead of really going in a technical science. So in short, what I want to highlight here is, I think in many ways, when you talk of the adaptation, science is important, but I think it's important, more important is to engage our farmers and learn from them and listen to them. Probably we can find a solution in our own local areas. With that, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Dasho. Indeed, a great statement on how, from the national government, we should be caring about our local people. So fantastic to hear about the experience you have just shared. And now, after listening to 3 experiences from the national level and their vision, it is time to go to the subnational level, so this intermediate level that acts as key between the national and the local. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jacques Schaufflige, Minister for the Environment, Nature and Agriculture of the Government of Flanders in Belgium. Minister Schaufflige holds a law degree from the University of Ghent. She is at present in her 2nd term as Minister for the Environment of Flanders, where her main achievements include good governance and sustainable development, non-ionizing relation of or affordable building land, among other. Earlier to her present position, she was a member of the Flemish Parliament, a local councillor, and also a legal advisor. From those positions, she was involved in planning, youth and youth infrastructure, as well as nature development and tourism. Besides, Minister Schaufflige is an international leader, as she holds the position of President of Energy for SD and guides our network in the various actions we develop before the UNFCCC, the CVD, the UNEP, or the local authorities' major groups within UNIDESA. So it is my pleasure to introduce Minister Schaufflige, with who we would like her to share with us in her position as Minister for Flanders, but also as a representative of the Belgian federal government, and having in mind her past experience at the local level. We would like to hear how she is ensuring coordination between the different governmental levels to achieve climate adaptation on the ground.
Thank you for the introduction, Your Highness, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to attend this event. Adaptation is very important, and I'm happy to present you some examples of how Flanders, and Flanders is a region within Belgium, how we are taking action. The effects of climate change are impossible to ignore, even in Flanders. The past years, we witnessed the rise of the sea level, higher temperatures, longer periods of drought in summer, more rainfall in winter, and a higher risk of heavy storms. And we all know climate change will continue to increase pressure. And that's why Flanders adopted the Flemish Adaptation Plan. This plan is one element in a larger framework, a framework of the Flemish Climate Policy Plan. And that plan also deals with mitigation. The 2nd version of this plan is in effect since 2013, and it has its horizon set on 2020. Climate change is a challenge that goes beyond regional and national borders. And therefore, climate policy is taken up by the International Forum. It is important to note that the Flemish Adaptation Plan was developed within an international and also national context. On the Belgian level, a national strategy was formulated that sets out the central principles of the adaptation policy. The EU's policy, and more specifically their own adaptation plan, can be seen as an addition and support to what is developed in the regions and countries. Climate change affects many sectors, not only environment or nature, but also industry, energy, agriculture, and health. Therefore, we started from the basic idea that each policy sector needs to work out its own specific response to climate change. They do that through studies, new initiatives, and financing. An integrated approach is key. It's what we like to call the climate reflex, where considerations on adaptation are taken into account when drawing up sectoral plans and strategies. Equally important is, of course, stakeholder participation. when developing a plan, it is essential to engage with all stakeholders to make sure that the implementation will succeed. Adaptation in Flanders goes beyond the activities of the government of Flanders. Initiatives from citizens, private companies, or cities are equally important to face these challenges. We need to work together with all stakeholders, and our job as a government is to give guidance, stimulate and inform them as much as possible. As a minister, I also want to support local climate actions and give them more visibility. To that end, I set up the Climate Award. It's a yearly competition in which local governments are stimulated to invest in innovative climate projects. 10 initiatives are selected, and they receive a monetary prize and also publicity. Within the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy Framework, the Majors Adapt, the Flemish government is elaborating a tool to support local governments in the development of their own climate strategy. Climate adaptation comes with costs that should be lower than the prevented damages. In order to lower costs, it's crucial to adopt and implement adaptation measures in a timely manner. But we have to keep in mind that actions taken by the government should be feasible, affordable, and acceptable. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, looking at the results, the first progress reports were very encouraging. It showed that progress has been made in all sectors, but of course there is still some room for improvement. We are on track, but we didn't reach the destination yet. The environment sector is very committed, not just by coordinating the plan and guiding other sectors, but also by implementing measures. Measures such as the management of nature, reserves and forests, the conservation of different species, incorporation of the climate reflex in environmental impact reviews, information campaigns on the importance of healthy soils, and studies on the influence of climate change in material flow cycles. We have been successful in integrating ecosystem-based adaptation solutions in education, and we continue to integrate this idea in other policy processes. As you may know, I'm not just here as a Flemish minister, but also as a co-chair for the North of Energy 4SD, the network of regional governments for sustainable development. It is widely acknowledged that subnational governments, such as regions, states, provinces and cities, are key players on the ground to limit and tackle climate change efficiently. 50 to 80% of adaptation and mitigation actions will be implemented at the subnational level. We have to think global and act local. Subnational governments from all over the world already show their commitment and their engagement. Because subnational governments are placed between national and local governments, we know citizens' expectations. We can raise awareness and promote sustainable consumption and production. We are in a good position to promote policy coordination, coherence, and vertical integration. Subnational governments are in sum an essential nexus between the national and local levels. We have shown to be key actors in an innovative climate policy, and we will continue to do so, also by learning from each other. Last year, the Paris Agreement took account of these strengths and the need to take action on the floor. In its preamble, the agreement affirms the importance of cooperating with cities and subnational governments. In closing, I'd like to assure the audience that Flanders, as well as the many members of Energy for SD, will continue to work together in facing the challenge of climate change. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Schauffele. Indeed, an excellent presentation on how the three levels of governments work together, and brilliant idea, this climate award from the regional level promoting local action. And now it is the moment to present our last but not least speaker, Mr. Aditya Bahadur. He's a Regional Program Development Manager of the Action on Climate Today at the Oxford Policy Management in India. Mr. Bahadur is graduated by the Delhi University, holds a Master in Development Studies, and has a PhD on climate change resilience in urban context. He is granted with a fellowship of the Royal Geographical Society in 2014, and last year with the World Social Science Fellowship. He counts with 10 years of experience in research, evaluation, and practice on disaster risk reduction, climate change, and development. He is responsible for numerous publications in regarded academic journals, being his work cited by the IPCC. Earlier, he served as a research coordinator of one of the world's largest community-level resilience building initiatives running 9 countries, and he was also involved in many projects developed by prestigious foundations such as the Hewlett, Shell, or Rockefeller ones, and he was also involved with projects developed by ActionAid, UNSDR, UNESCAP, and UNICEF. Mr. Bahadur, we would like to know what are the main challenges of climate adaptation at local level, since you have been focusing your work in the urban context, and how is your project that you funded, Action on Climate Today, helping to achieve it? Thank you.
A very good afternoon to the distinguished panelists and to the audience here. It's really great to be here. I'm Aditya, and I work with the Action on Climate Today program with Oxford Policy Management. I'd like to start off by a big thank you to the organizers and to SACEP and Dr. Khurshid in particular, because this session is focused on adaptation, and I can't help feeling that adaptation is often treated as the ugly stepchild of the international policy debate. So it's fantastic that we're having such a rich discussion focused on adaptation, which is really at the center of development, of key development debates on development in developing countries across the world. I think the imperative for adaptation is extremely strong and is becoming stronger. The climate change is having a real and tangible impact on economic growth across the world. We work across 4 countries, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And we found, for example, in India, that at the state level, climate change will erode somewhere between 1.4 and 4.3% of GDP of states within India. The ADB is estimated that South Asia as a whole will lose about 1.8% of its GDP by 2050 as a result of climate change impacts. Now, these percentages, etc., sound a bit vague, but let's look at the case of Kerala. Our analysis shows that between now and 2050, Kerala's GDP will grow 5 times. But as a result of climate impacts, it will only grow 3 times. So the imperative for dealing with the impacts of climate change through adaptation and building resilience is critical. Apart from only economic growth, adaptation is also vital from the point of view of justice and equity, because after all, it's the poor and vulnerable who suffer the most from climate impacts at the local level. And here are a few stark examples. 138,000 people died in Cyclone Nargis, but only 43 people died in Hurricane Sandy, and they were roughly of equivalent intensity. 225,000 people died in the Haitian earthquake, but only 4 people died in the earthquake in New Zealand last week. Again, roughly equivalent magnitude. Apart from affecting people in poor and rich countries differentially, we also find that marginalized populations and women in particular are worst affected by the impacts of climate change and disasters in general. I mean, 77% of those who died in Indonesia as a result of the tsunami were women. 61% of the people who suffered as a result of Cyclone Nargis, again, were women. Climate change also is further entrenching poverty and vulnerability across the world. In Pakistan, as a result of the Pakistan floods, we found that 15% more people dipped into poverty in the flood-affected areas as a result of the floods. So it's not only doom and gloom. It's not only that we need to deal with climate change impacts to adaptation because of its impact on economic growth and because of social justice and equity issue. We're also finding that adaptation can yield a rich dividend, and there is the possibility to harness a resilience dividend. We've done some research in Senegal and in Tabasco, and we find that putting in protective infrastructure and adaptive infrastructure helps grow the economy and attract jobs, and can be a key component of economic growth pathways in vulnerable countries across the world. So it's in recognizing these imperatives, the Action on Climate Today program works in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nepal. We work at the federal or central level in Afghanistan, in Nepal, but at the subnational level and the national level in Pakistan and India. And we're doing 2 or 3 key things. We're providing direct technical assistance to government in 9 locations across these 4 South Asian countries to really affect transformational shifts in the way policy functions to enable big changes in the adaptation policy architecture in these countries. And I'll give you a few examples of the type of projects we're doing. We do interventions in 4 domains broadly. We work in agriculture. This includes climate-proofing agricultural policy in Afghanistan with the cooperation of the ministry. We've climate-proofed the natural resource management strategy to make sure that it's fit for purpose and functions in a changing climate. In India, we're working with state governments to climate-proof value chains for different kinds of crops. We work in climate-resilient water management, and we're doing this by helping states prepare for floods, by working on transboundary flood management issues as well. We work on the vitally important issue of climate finance, where we not only work with national and subnational governments in ensuring that they devote more domestic or more of their own resources towards activities that yield an adaptation benefit, but we also help national and subnational entities apply for international climate finance. In cooperation with the ministry in Pakistan, we recently helped the country apply for GCF funding, and it's great to see that Pakistan was successful in its application for a $37 million grant from the GCF for adaptation in the country. We're also helping strengthen institutions across the 4 countries where we're working, and this includes climate change knowledge management cells at the subnational level, but also climate finance units at the national level, where in Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as at the state level and in India. So that's enough of a plug for my program. I want to also focus on sort of 5 key things that we've learned on adaptation as a result of our work with the government in these 4 countries. First and foremost, it's apparent to us that we need to work towards strengthening government institutions to adaptation from the get-go. Personally, I think we've had far too many flash-in-the-pan, donor-driven projects that sort of conduct experiments at the local level with the right intention of making sure that learnings from those go into policy. But many times the link between these experiments of donor-driven projects and influencing policy, that link does not happen. So it's vitally important to start off with the intention of working with the government and strengthening systems that already exist. And we are clearly doing this from the get-go by providing direct technical assistance to governments in 9 locations across 4 countries. Secondly, as the secretary from Bhutan rightly said, for successful adaptation, it's vitally important to mix different streams of knowledge to come up with adaptation priorities that are fit for purpose. It's not only important to do high-level technical studies using satellites on the exposure and risk faced by different areas. It's vitally important to also understand vulnerability and sensitivity of marginalized populations in some of the areas that are affected by the impacts of climate change. And it's only when this top-down scientific understanding of how the climate change is manifesting itself in particular areas, and this bottom-up understanding of how populations are experiencing the impacts of climate change, will we have adaptation actions that are fit for purpose. And we've seen this in our work, where we're helping the government of Nepal, supporting them in preparing the national adaptation plan through combining top-down understanding of exposure and bottom-up understandings of vulnerability. The third thing that we found vitally important is to select multiple entry points for ensuring that adaptation enters institutional systems within governments. So it's not only important to deal with environmental entry points. In Kerala, for instance, we're strengthening health systems and making sure that the health systems at the state level are geared to dealing with the health impacts that climate change will bring. In other states, we're using disaster risk management as an entry point to talk about adaptation. And yet in other states, we're looking at forest policy or agricultural policy. So it's only when you use multiple entry points to mainstream adaptation do you get something that's sustainable and something that makes an institutional difference. Number 4, it's vitally important to integrate vertically. I think you asked me the question about how to link local with national level when talking about adaptation, and I think that's really important. Time and time again, we see national policies that are out of sync with what's happening at the local level, out of sync with the reality of how populations are experiencing the impacts of climate change. And time again, we see really interesting and valuable local examples which are not scaled up. So it's vitally important to link adaptation policy vertically, and we are actively working towards this in Nepal. So Nepal's national adaptation plan is not only going to reflect the priorities of the national government, we're actually linking with district level and state level institutions across 9 thematic areas to make sure that adaptation priorities flow from the bottom up. Finally, we can talk about adaptation till the cows come home, but we'll get nowhere unless we have robust results reporting on adaptation progress. We recently did a review of all the methodologies that exist to measure adaptation and resilience, and found that there is currently a plethora of at least 60 existing frameworks that operate at different levels that help measure adaptation. Yet we find far too many of these frameworks are focused on measuring particular outputs, but not really focused on measuring outcomes in adaptation. So people are looking at things like the number of trainings done with subnational subnational governments on adaptation, but not really looking at whether this has permitted populations in large areas to deal with the impacts of climate change over time while still growing and developing in a number of different ways. It's only when we look at well-being, changes in well-being over a large period of time, despite the shocks and stresses imposed by climate change, can we get an accurate picture of whether a country or a region is becoming more adapted to climate change. And we're working with governments in these 9 locations across 4 countries to make sure that they're able to communicate the progress that they're making with adaptation effectively. I'll stop now, but of course, very happy to take the discussion forward with anyone after the session or in the question and answer session. Thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badu, for this thorough explanation on this vertical integration and the risks of climate adaptation. Since we have some time, I'd like to propose a very last question, very quick question to all speakers, to the 3 panelists that represent the national level. Since we are at COP22, CMP12, and GMA1, I would like to ask you, from your countries, what are the main challenges or challenge that you envisage when implementing the Paris Agreement in your territory? Maybe you can respond to them.
Thank you very much. Yes, there are challenges in implementing the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, of course, hasn't come out of nowhere. There was a long, drawn-out process leading to that agreement. And we have been actively engaged in that process for quite some time. And we have been following up the negotiations even lately in the Kigali relating to the Montreal Protocol and the amendments relating to the CFC. So there are challenges, I would say, in implementing, because we may prepare the best regulations, the best laws, the best plans, but it is the implementation on the ground which actually matters. And there we feel that it requires considerable effort, much more than I think is envisaged for a policymaker sitting away from the ground reality. We find, for example, I speak now about the devastating floods that took place in Pakistan in 2010, 2011. Which caused damage to the tune of $15 billion. There were about 20 million people displaced. And we found that there are a number of problems, not just the physical problem of providing relief to these displaced people, but also particularly the female gender, the women, were much more affected than the men. And they were affected, of course, because of lack of clean water for drinking purposes, for hygiene, for cooking, and also because of the danger of diarrheal diseases and vector-borne diseases to the children. So it was really a problem for reaching out to the women of the area in particular, to encourage them to we are a very resilient people, but in the face of adversity, it requires more than just willpower to be able to adjust to the situation. So I would say it is basically trying to ensure that the policies that are made in the provincial capitals or in the big cities are actually conveyed to the people on the ground. And I may mention that it is not just a physical problem, but also a mental problem, because as a consequence of this displacement, we find that a lot of psychological problems also arise, particularly depression in the face of disaster. So I think that is what I would like to say on the subject.
Thank you, Minister Said. Prince, please.
Thank you very much. With your permission, can you all hear me? As His Excellency mentioned, we have very similar problems of, well, we foresee some problems of implementation on the ground. And I'll mention it very clearly why. Afghanistan has been through 42 years of an ongoing conflict. We have to educate our people about the ravages of climate change, which we have already started at Kabul University and other universities and colleges. We have started the subject of the environment as a curriculum in schools and high schools. It took us 8 years, but we got there. Some people think, as His Excellency, the Secretary of Environment of the Kingdom of Bhutan mentioned, he looked at the glaciers and he saw an alarming rate. And I was in the Wakhan corridor, which borders our brother neighbor of Pakistan to the south, Tajikistan to the north, and our other neighbor, China, to the east. I was there in June of 2014, and I was again there in November of 2014. And like His Excellency, I was looking at the glaciers of the Pamir Mountains, and the highest points is probably the 5th highest mountain in the world, and the melting down was alarming. But when I asked the people, I said, I asked them a question, the local people, the Wakhi people, what is your first concern? And they said economic security. They didn't mention the environment. They said economic security. I said, are you noticing any changes at the glacial melts? Most of the people who are actually living in there either did not notice it or were not aware of it. So that really took me aback. So we decided we were going to make another trip. We made another trip, and imagine, flying from Kabul to Keret is not simple, and only a 6-person aircraft can go at that altitude and lands basically on an tarmac, just rough ground. Is just, we have been lucky. I'm speaking with you. Twice the plane was about to crash. But if you are determined to do something, you'll have to go and seek to do it. So on our second trip, we brought the pictures, brought maps, but in a way that the people would understand it. Nothing fancy, nothing too scientific. We tried to speak the people's language. We tried to give them, convey the concepts and their own realities in which they found themselves. The other problem that I see we are facing, Afghanistan, Raja was saying, 20 million people were displaced at the floodings of the year 2010. That is, if you add another 10 million, that would be the total population of Afghanistan. Afghanistan right now is between 30 and 32 million people. There is a low intensity, as I mentioned right at the beginning. There is a conflict going on. And for us to reach those very places that actually matter in the sense that we have to implement the Paris Agreement, the arm of the governments and the local authorities cannot reach there because of insecurity, which I hope we can overcome that. You know, there's an old saying, if there is a will, there's always a way. And I'm not the kind of person who believes in cookie cutters. Things, as we say, you know, think globally, but act locally. You know, we cannot have cookie cutters. Every country, as His Excellency, the Minister of Environment of the Kingdom of Bhutan also mentioned that what is good for one does not mean it's absolutely and necessarily is good for the other. We have to keep into consideration the conditions of each country, then come down to wherever they are. I mean, look at the island states in the Pacific. If the sea levels rise up another meter, they're in trouble. We are speaking about the lives of 600 million people, over 500 million people in the world, and not to mention hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who live in the coastal areas of let's say, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, the United States itself, and all of Central and Latin America, just to mention but a few, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. So also another problem that I see is capacity in the country. We should have by now, 15 years after the exit of the last regime and the formation of the new governments with the United Nations mandate and internationally recognized, I would have thought that, you know, talking about capacity building, we should have been in the third generation by now. But unfortunately, we have not been able, for whatever reason that there was, we are still in the first generation. So that's an area. Capacity building is extremely important, and I'm counting on our international partners. I'm counting on our neighbors, such as Pakistan, who'd help us. You know, if we stand as one voice, as one bloc, and act as one bloc, I think we'll be much more successful. Contrary to, if we were just a lone voice in the desert, nobody will hear our voice. That's another problem that I foresee, but I hope that my sayings are all wrong. Then there are some dark clouds floating about with powerful people who are climate change deniers. Madam Natalia, let me assure you, from a scientific point of view, that climate change is here. Climate change is very real, and climate change is having direct and immediate effect on the lives of the most vulnerable, the poorest people in the world. And whoever thinks that climate change is a made-up issue in order to garner money or to steal money from somebody else, those people should really look at the science-based information. I would gladly invite them to my country. I would gladly invite them to come and see the Pamir Mountains. I would gladly invite them to come and see the Himalayan Hindu Kush mountain ranges and see our glaciers and see it with their own eyes. Seeing is believing. The impact is having on agriculture, the impact is having on people's health, the floodings, the desertification, the shrinking of our lakes, the water table in Kabul. It hasn't rained properly for the last 3 years. Kabul, the capital city, is a population of almost 6 million people in there. And the water table has gone down by 19 meters. That's alarming. For us, it's alarming. For others, it may sound like a conspiracy that there is no climate change. Please put yourself in the shoes of millions, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of other people also. But to go on the optimistic side, I've always said it in audiences, and I'll say it today with your permission, that I'm neither a pessimist nor an optimist. I'm just a realist. I have to deal with the realities I find my people, my country, and myself on a daily basis. And I have to adjust to those realities continuously. Those realities could be created in the next 15 minutes, or in the next hour, or in the next 24 hours, or in the next week, or next month. And we have to look forward. We cannot look back. Whatever has taken place has taken place. As the old saying goes, do not look at the past, because you cannot change the things that have taken place. And do not be too much troubled for the future is only but a vision. Act now. Live with dignity. Live with certainty. Live with love, with compassion, with tolerance, so that one day it'll be worth remembering. And with those remarks, I would like to close it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Prince Mustafa. I think it's been a lesson for all of us and really inspired. I'm personally really moved. Secretary?
I'll touch on 2 areas. One is on the reporting under this process or the discussion that we are taking. Now, for a small country or least developed countries, we have an issue actually if we have a format similar to the other developed countries. I think, for example, adaptation and mitigations are going on at your own level. Now, when we start working on reporting, the question is from where we want to start, saying that this is where we have started with. And I think there are a lot of questions arises when we go into negotiation in the next round, particularly looking at the modalities, procedures, and developing format. That is quite critical for us to look for. Secondly, I want to touch briefly on access to finance. Now, when you talk of finance, I think there's JEF, there's GCF, that is LDCF, there is Adaptation Fund. But for a small country, I think we have to always depend on outside to help us to get money. And that process is sometimes quite lengthy. But back at home, our farming community cannot wait actually to come there. They need immediately. So how can we actually help each other to enhance this process? And more importantly, even I would say that among the implementing partners, I think there should be some sort of a coordination, probably good collaboration. I think if they do, probably recipient country will be in a very comfortable position, because in many ways in our own back at home, we do not have that capacity to reach everywhere. We have a small mass, and I think we have to be very judicious or selective how effectively we can use our people to get what we want. So in that sense, my belief and my observation here, there is a strong optimism, in this Marrakesh, and I'm looking ahead. When we meet, we maintain that same, optimism, and collectively, we can really, segregate among the groups and regions, so that we demand what we want and we demand what we can do. So with that, probably I will close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. So after having these three testimonies from the national level about the difficulties on the implementation of the Paris Agreement, I would like to ask the subnational level, so that is Minister Schaufliege, what difficulties do you find when collaborating with the rest of ministers within your regional government? Because you are the Minister for the Environment, but you need to convince the other ministers whose dossiers really are affected and affect climate change. So how do you cope with that?
Yes, thank you. Our country, Belgium, is very complicated because we have a federal level and we have the regional level. But the regional level has fully competence on environment and also climate. But we have to work together because here, but also in the European Union, it's the member state Belgium that sits around the table. So we have a system that we sit around the table, internal in Belgium, and we try to come to good compromises. That's not always easy. It's a little bit like here in big. The whole world is here around the table, and we do it with the three regions and then the federal level. But we are used to it and it works. It takes sometimes a lot of time, and that's not good. It can be more efficiently, but we have a framework in which we work. And then when we look at the regional level, of course, we set out the targets, but we also need the cities and the communities to do it also on the floor. And there you see that we give subsidies, finance to the really local levels, the communities, the provinces to do their job, but not only money, because we don't have enough money to pay it all, but we also have a toolbox where the local authorities can choose what's the best for them, because each city, community is different. So it's a framework, and they can look what's the best for them. We also have a website where then they can learn and see good practices. And that's how we try to manage all that. And of course, we also have annual reports where we see where we are and where we have to go. And so we can strengthen also the policy we have when we see that we don't reach the targets. That's how it works. It's complicated, our country, but I think it works. It's not always easy, also like here, where the whole world is around the table. We have a little community, but we also have to work together, and it's necessary, and we really want to battle against the climate change, and that's what is driving us, and that's why we work very hard to reach also that targets.
Thank you. Indeed, a difficult. So indeed, a difficult and complex procedure, but at the end, very productive because it creates ownership of the decisions. And there's a last question I would like to ask to Mr. Bahadur. The previous speakers have highlighted the need of raise of awareness of local communities. Since you are the organization that works more closely to these local communities, could you please explain us any program you develop in raising awareness of these peoples and with regards to climate adaptation?
Yeah, I think what's clear to me is quote unquote awareness raising drives don't really work. It's about having a genuine engagement and a genuine conversation with climate affected communities that really starts to mobilize action. I'll give you an example from my own work. I was working in Gorakhpur, which is a little city. When I say little, in India, it means 1 million people, on the Indo-Nepal border, where we were working with flood-affected slum communities. And we tried the usual thing. We distributed flyers about the health impacts of floods, etc. None of that sort of really mobilized the community. Then we switched tactics and we started doing sort of community meetings, literally about meetings about 100, 150 people sitting in a circle and talking about how different hazards are affecting the community. And from that, we started to put together a sort of a resilience strategy on how we can how we can battle some of those hazards. And ultimately, we did that in enough communities and came up with a city resilience strategy. And then the municipal corporation had to sit up and listen, because this was the sum of a large number of multi-stakeholder conversations taking place in an engaged sort of way with local communities as well as local politicians before we developed the city resilience plan that the government then adopted. So I think it's about making communities feel like, they have something to say, which they clearly do. It's about ensuring that you don't sacrifice community knowledge and privilege only scientific information. It's about developing shared learning with vulnerable communities and with experts so as to find actionable pathways of reducing vulnerability and building resilience.
Thank you very much. So it's the moment now to open questions to the kind audience. So if there are any questions to these wonderful speakers, this is the moment.
Asin Zia, University of Vermont. I have a question about, there are limits to adaptation. So what are you thinking about loss and damage mechanism, and whether there are any opportunities for the South Asian countries to tap into those resources as well?
Yes, we did want that the loss and damage mechanism should proceed forward from where it was left. But my people tell me that not much progress has been made on that front. It's a pity, because I think it's extremely important. And the whole principle of CBDR and historical responsibility, etc., will not be implemented if that loss and mechanism is not put on the ground.
I would echo the same words as His Excellency just mentioned. I hope that the loss and damage mechanism will take shape before the Paris agreements or the agreement itself, which kicks in 2020, would have been shaped. But right now, I echo the words of His Excellency. Much more work needs to be done. And we must have a program in place for those countries that are affected the most by loss and damage. Afghanistan is the least developed country with one of the lowest income per capita incomes on the planet. And then the least developed countries should work together to make themselves heard, as I said at the beginning of my speech. If you have one hand, if you put hands together, people hear you. But here in the desert, nobody can hear you. They can hear you. So we have to work together. We have no other choice. And we have to shape it. That's all I can say.
Any other reactions to the question proposed?
I'm going along with two excellencies here, so I fully support.
So any other question, please?
Yes, I want to know the opinion of the panelists on the proposal EIG, and I'm sorry, I'm from the Mexican delegation. We propose to have regional adaptation communications, let's say Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, since we share climatic problems, we share biodiversity, we share water, and of course we share cultural and other community problems. So perhaps to start thinking on a regional adaptation communication would be interesting. So I want to know what you think about that.
I think there's considerable scope for the type of cooperation that you are suggesting. The three countries that are sitting before you, representatives which are sitting before you, are all members of the South Asian Regional Cooperation, SAC, and we are discussing environment and climate change cooperation in that forum also. There is also South-South cooperation. can be a South Asian type of cooperation, but I think the cooperation is the need of the hour, because as you yourself said, the hazards are common. In many cases, the solutions are common. And I think that we can do much better, as Excellency Highness has also said, if we work together rather than work alone.
Any other reactions from the panelists? No? Any other questions from the floor, please?
Farooq from Ministry of Climate Change, Pakistan. My question is from Mr. Aditya. You talk about this national, subnational, and regional governance. The issue with adaptation is that the finances is available to the federal government, to all the financial institutions, be that United Nations or otherwise. But the planning, processing, and implementation of adaptation is to be carried out at the local level. They have no capacity at all. And they can't do the adaptation for these climate changes which are taking place. Do you have any idea, are you working on this, how to integrate these local government, their capacities with the federal government as far as finances are concerned?
Great, thank you. I think that's an excellent question, and this is an issue not only particular to Pakistan, but a large number of other South Asian countries as well. And we are working specifically on this issue. The Action on Climate Today program is working directly with the government of Punjab and specifically with the Agriculture Department as an example, where we're taking state-level agricultural policies and screening them for climate impacts to make sure that the policies that are coming out can withstand the impacts of a changing climate. We're also in discussion with a number of other departments to build institutional capacity within these subnational institutions, be it PND or Finance Department, to understand what climate change is and to really actively plan for it. I think there's a high amount of enthusiasm and there's a great amount of willingness that we see in Punjab and Pakistan. And we're actively working with the government there. In India, we're trying to do the same thing. For example, in Odisha, we've been successful in preparing an application for GCF, which has just been approved by the federal government as well. In India, the state it's for state-level actions on adaptation. So we'll hopefully see GCF funding flowing to the state level. Also in India, now we have the National Adaptation Fund, which states can access to fund adaptation activities, and we're building the capacity of the 6 states where we're working to access this pot of money that the federal government has made available for the state level. But what we find is that sustained engagement at the state level is vital to build capacity. It's not only about going in, preparing a DPR, and expecting that the state government will take that money and program it. At the subnational level, there are a large number of priorities and a large number of exigencies that are unfolding every day. So it's really about a sustained commitment, and that's why we've set up offices at the subnational level in 7 out of our 9 locations where we're working directly with state governments and provincial governments to enhance capacity.
Thank you very much. Since we don't have time for further questions from the ground, I would invite the all-kind audience to approach our speakers should they have more questions for them. And to this moment, I would just like to call on stage Dr. Khurshid, who will close the session on behalf of Energy First D and SACEP. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It was a very fruitful and very enriched debates that we have from the learned panelists and the participation of audience about the issues of national, subnational coherence, coordination and cooperation on adaptation in South Asia as well as our European partner. So I am highly thankful to the panelists that they have given their time and they shared their experiences at the highest level with the audience, and to the audience that they gave their time and they participated in this debate. Before ending, I would like the Minister for Climate Change Pakistan to just launch this report which SACEP has developed. And we had a consultative session on this report last month at Colombo, where all the SACEP member country participated. So this report is part of a bigger report which will be coming for the next year. But we are on an abstract for this session. that we have specially developed, carved out of the consultation we had at Colombo. And before that, we had continuous sessions last year and before last year on adaptation challenges in South Asia. So I would request the Minister to just launch this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be asked to launch this report. I just was going through it, and it is obviously very informative, very interesting. I congratulate the SACEP for producing it and have the great honor of launching it on your behalf. Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
and
sir.
congratulations to you especially.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Minister for Climate Change. Now I would close this session and would invite all of you for refreshment, which is waiting outside. Thank you very much.